Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Bird's Eye View, where we connect the past to the present in order to understand what makes the Black community unique. I am your host, Trenda Byrd of ByrdOwlconsulting, and this is part 2 of my presentation from the Small Museum Association Conference. So I hope you enjoyed the first part of the presentation, so here is now the second part. Hi guys, so if you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. For one, it's free. There's creation tools that will allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your computer or from your phone. Anchor will also distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast as well, so you don't have to have a lot of listeners in order to make money. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So be sure to download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Now back to our show. So going to historic Brattonsville, how can you implement some of these things into your actual work that you're doing at your sites? So just to give you a little bit of background about historic Brattonsville, while I was at historic Brattonsville, I was the African American History Program Manager, also a historic interpreter. So my job was there. I was responsible for interpreting enslaved life and culture. And that is actually me right here in this picture right here. So I would have to dress as they would have dressed we did 18th and 19th century interpretation. So these are just some pictures of, that is the Homestead House up the top left. Some people might call it the big house, but we had called it the Homestead House. And a little bit of background about the site itself. The site presents the history of Scots-Irish and the enslaved in South Carolina, upstate South Carolina, by interpreting the story of the Bratton family and the enslaved. It features more than 30 historical structures in from the 1760s to the late 19th century, and is actually located in McConnell, South Carolina, which is about 10 minutes outside of Rock Hill, South Carolina, which is about 15, 20 minutes outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. And so again, that's a picture of me. A little bit of history about the site. So in the 18th century, the site actually interprets two sides. So there's actually a main road that goes in between the site, which is actually the same road, like historically, that was that appeared back then during that time, but now, of course, it's paved. So on the 18th century side, they start off the history with Colonel William Bratton in 1790. And so during that time, Colonel Bratton, he owned about 12 enslaved people, which actually at that time made him a very significant slaveholder in that county. And in the county itself, it was home to less than 1,000 enslaved people. Now, when Colonel Bratton died in 1815, he actually had increased his ownership to 23 enslaved people. And then after his wife died a year later, she inherited those enslaved people. And after she died, their son, Dr. John Bratton, inherited those enslaved. Now, Dr. John Bratton, his story starts on the 19th century side. So over on the 19th century side, according to the 1830 census, Dr. Bratton had about 39 enslaved people, and then by 1840 he had 113. And what I didn't put on here is that by 1843-44 he had 139 enslaved people. Now, that is a very significant amount of enslaved people, especially for this part of South Carolina, because a lot of times when you think of South Carolina plantations, you think of the Low Country, you think of Charleston, you think of maybe Johns Island. But here in the upstate part of South Carolina, they had some very large plantations. In fact, I think we can make the argument that this was probably the largest plantation in upstate South Carolina. What I did at Brattonsville, not only is it a working farm, is we actually would plant cotton, pick cotton, plow the field, had to take care of the livestock. We would have different school programs. We did interpretive programming. I did a lot of cooking demonstrations, domestic work, of course, farming. One of the things that I would do with some of the program that I did, we would do the program, but I like to kind of expand the program and make it interesting for the kids. For example, we had a program called White Gold. And so apparently, of course, white gold was the cotton. That was the cash crop down in South Carolina. And what we would do, basically that program was just about teaching about the economics of cotton and how that was generating a profit. And so what I did was I took the time to actually look at not only what kind of money cotton was making, but then also comparing it to the profit of having an enslaved person. And so what I did with the kids, and this was a high school program, so I actually went and looked up, for example, the most expensive slave that the Brattons had at that time was a gentleman by the name of Adam. He was the blacksmith. And he was at that time worth about $400. So what I did was I got a converting calculator and looked up what kind of money that would look like in today's time. And so in today's time, that would be, I think that was equivalent to like over $5,000, if I'm not mistaken. And so essentially what I did was, because we had the whole probate list of all 139 slaves, and I looked up it took some time, but I looked up all those pricings and put it all together. And so when we were talking about white gold and talking about cotton, I asked the students, I said, do you think it was more money in making cotton or more money in owning people? And so, of course, they all thought about cotton. And I was like, well, think about it. When you add up all the enslaved people, and the cost, I think, for that time period was like a little bit over $32,000, $35,000. In today's money, that would have been over $1 million. Just in the fact of owning people, okay? Not the cotton, not whatever else he was selling, but it was just in owning people. And so drawing that correlation from the past to the present for those kids, it really got them thinking about just how lucrative of a business slavery was, okay? So kind of expanding that. So how can you incorporate women's suffrage at historical plantation houses, even some of your traditional museums that you're at? So for programming, try to link similarities of suffrage to enslaved culture. Meaning that, like we're talking about before, expanding the conversation of suffrage from just voting. Looking at ways where suffrage actually started with coming to the shores of Virginia and what that meant for these black people, for these black women now. Because when these people came to these shores, I like it when I go to museums, and it's interesting because I will read these panels and they're talking about enslaved people, but they say African Americans. You can't be African American and also be enslaved. You didn't have rights. You wasn't a citizen. So even when you're thinking about your language and how you're presenting these things, it's very, very crucial. And so looking at suffrage from a point of how can we tell these stories as a journey, okay? Featuring programming, like if you're doing a lecture, featuring programming about some of these black reformers and getting more into their stories and helping people to understand that it wasn't just about voting, okay? It was more than voting. It was about trying to make people see you as a person, see you as a human being. Because even today, you have people that don't want to see black people as people. Like, it all connects. If you're at a traditional museums, you can always do lectures, you can do programming that touches on things that were taking place for black women and looking at those differences, just like what I did today. We looked at suffrage for white women, then we looked at suffrage for black women, because this stuff was happening at the same time. Like, what do you think some of the conversations that were going on between Sojourner Truth and Ida B. Wells? What kind of conversation do you think that might have been going on between some of these women? What about between Sojourner Truth and maybe Stan? Like, imagining what would be happening. So it's like digging deeper in developing programs that will really stir up conversations. Because now we're at a point in time where these conversations, they need to be had, because not only is this, celebrating or, the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, but let's look at beyond the 19th Amendment and looking at today and connecting everything together. Some other tips, of course, like I said, making connections. Creating themes would help you kind of bring in some of these things. Like, for example, one of the things that I kind of, just create off the cusp was from the enslaved women to Black women, 21st century, the voting rights journey. So now you're able to expand between what is enslavement all the way to the Voting Rights Act. And then you can also even take it beyond. You can take it beyond where that means where you can start to have other kind of conversations, like more towards race relations. Because I like having conversations about race relations, because when you're talking about things that are happening today, there's a history of what happened. It's not anything new. There's a history that's connected to it. So bringing that history to the forefront and helping people understand that this is why this is happening, okay? Be willing to discuss the tough subjects. As museums, as museum professionals, we are supposed to be a safe haven for these conversations. And so that means that it is okay to discuss these topics, because people are looking to us for that information to be that safe haven. And I would just implore you to be open and honest, because now it's about telling the truth and not trying to sugarcoat it in a way where we just kind of water it down, because this is not a history that you can actually water down. And push the limit. I'm all about pushing the limit when it comes to talking about these subjects, because there are a lot of things that we were taught in school that really hadn't really touched the surface, or things that wasn't really true. And I'm finding these things out more and more, and it's like, wait a minute, this is what I was taught in school, but there's another side to it. So start doing programming that answer the questions of what's on the other side. And of course, ask the uncomfortable questions. I always, when I was at Brattonsville, and there was a reason why I was always in the kitchen. One, because it was fun cooking in the kitchen, but I found that it was easier to have some of these difficult conversations, because when people saw that I was cooking, they'll come to the kitchen and say, oh, what you cooking? It smells good in here. And I would tell them, what I'm cooking, and I would tell them that yes, this was a very famous enslaved dish. Some of your favorite foods are actually enslaved food, like barbecue, like watermelon, came from Africa. So you get these conversations going. So then that opens the door to start having to ask the difficult questions. So after, we talk about the food and stuff, I would ask them certain questions. So getting them in a space that would make them comfortable, but then also start engaging with them. Because if you come at somebody like, okay, what do you think about the N-word? Nobody wants to talk about that, right? It's a hard subject. But if you ease the person into it, then you can kind of get a little bit more out of someone. But ask those uncomfortable questions, because this is the time where it needs to be said. Are there any questions? Any questions whatsoever? Yes, ma'am.
So one of the things that I see a lot in reading and just viewing and just being a viewer, I noticed the word enslave and I noticed the word slave. From an African-American point of view, I think enslaved is better to be said than just slavery, because there is a tone with that.
It is.
And sometimes I think we, on both sides, or how many different sides, we just think of it as just a period. But enslaved, I noticed in your PowerPoint there was times where the word was used and sometimes. And I'm just wondering, words matter.
They do.
And I'm always trying to think of the 3-year-old or the 4-year-old that are coming up now, and what type of wording that we should be giving them so they can know the breadth of what African Americans and Americans went through during those periods. So, I mean, even in the conversations of what makes people feel comfortable, I mean, just besides cooking, and there was downright terrorism for African Americans. And we tend not to say those words, the words that are really what it is. And I know it's just a matter of getting people comfortable, but truth is so important to peel back and to say, we were terrorized instead of we were enslaved, we were a business, but there were a lot of terrorism. There was rape, there was abuse, and we tend to kind of back away from that. But I think, I don't care if you're in the kitchen cooking or whatever you're doing, we need to kind of heal from that. So the way to heal from it is look at it.
And I totally agree. And when it comes to word usage and when it comes to some programming, because I have taught 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds about slavery. They understand what's right and wrong. And so when I say word usage, it's in terms of the age group. You're not going to talk about rape and terror with up to a certain age, because that's kind of inappropriate. That's kind of they're not mentally there yet. But yes, use the word rape, use the word terrorism if you have with high schoolers, college students, with adults, because those are words that they need to hear and understand that this was a life that you had enslaved. You had people that wanted to die. You had people that were throwing themselves over the boat during the Middle Passage, where they didn't even make it to the New World because they did not want to go through that life. So when I say, and nowadays we're using, historians are going more into enslaved, because enslaved is a condition. When you say slave, that's a noun, but that's not who I am. I am not a slave. I was enslaved. You see what I'm saying? So that's why word usage is very, very important. Yes?
I noticed exactly the same thing with enslaved people. But it almost seems to me that using enslaved people instead of slaves is almost counterproductive to your point, in the sense of the point that was just made here about rape and beatings and all that. When we think of slaves, and I'm looking at it from my educational background, we think of the beating, we think of all the terrible things that happened. Enslaved people almost makes that, it decreases, I think, the impact of using the word, instead of using the word slavery, which we do associate with all those bad things, but perhaps enslaved people we don't.
Yeah, and that's going to take some changing, because when you say enslaved people, you are recognizing that they first and foremost were people. You are humanizing them, because what the goal was to dehumanize them. So now when we're saying enslaved, we're recognizing that these were actually people, and the conditions that they were in was that they were enslaved. So that's going to take some changing of the mind, because I do agree. Like when you do say slave, you think about all this horrible stuff.
Right.
But because we're trying to change our language to become more human, then it's going to take some time. Just like with anything, it's going to take time. I think, did you have a question in the back?
I just wanted to mention that my name's Lisa Hayes, and I perform a one-woman show about Carrie Chapman Catt, who led the 19th Amendment over the finish line. And as I was creating the play, I really wrestled with how to incorporate the fact that she was accused of being a white supremacist, and the fact that African American women were marginalized and really left out of the history of the movement. So what I did was, the premise of the play is that a college is dedicating a statue to Mary Church Terrell, and there's a whole Twitter storm, #white supremacist. And so she's doing a rehearsal of her show to convince the student protesters that there's something more to that. But then that gives me the opportunity to bring in the issues related to, yes, she was called a white supremacist, but, you know, she was trying to be pragmatic and understood that they needed the white suffrage vote from the South if they were going to pass the amendment, and that she was friends with Mary Church Terrell.
Mm-hmm.
And then I can talk about Mary Church Terrell and, you know, giving this speech at an international women's conference in Europe and giving the opening remarks in English and fluent French and German. So it kind of educates the audience about the whole scope of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of museum educators focus on K to 4th grade education programs. Could you recommend resources for storybooks, activities, appropriate programming for that age group for the voting rights journey?
Yes. So not off the top of my head, but what I can do, I can send you some stuff. Yes.
Okay, for that information, I would say if you're going to be doing it specifically on women's suffrage, I would go to a website called amightygirl.com. Some people in this room know it. It's great for empowering people. It's about empowering young ladies for getting their things. And it's for modern women too, but they have a great section of their website that is about books by subject and by age.
Okay.
So you can find things about slavery, and you can find things about women's suffrage that are books specifically about that. It's a great piece for people to catch.
Yes.
I just wanted to mention, if you're not aware, the American Association for State and Local History has a value statement for the 19th Amendment. That's, I think, a very useful tool, especially if you're just starting to wrap your head around programming. It's intended to broaden the perception of the history of suffrage, connect women's suffrage to both the present and the future. And then also it's got a whole bunch of great suggestions for resources, conversation starters, ways you might begin to address it. And it does bring in a lot of the things that you addressed today. So if you go to AASLH, website, look for the 19th Amendment value statement, you might find it useful.
Thank you.
Hey, Trenda, thank you for that really interesting presentation. I've got a lot of thoughts. You went a lot of different ways with that too. But what's really coming out in my mind is when we're talking about the language that we use, it's all about like reframing that power dynamic
Mm-hmm.
and giving that power back to people. So you have to kind of keep that in mind, like you said, in terms of making enslaved people's, dehumanizing them. At the end, when we're talking about the kitchen and drawing people in, what I was hearing you talk about really is breaking down people's barriers
Right.
and moving past that so that we can facilitate those more difficult conversations. And, that in that example with the kitchen, we all gather around in the kitchen and
Yeah.
have conversations, right? So that's very accessible, I think, for people. So any way that we could, use our sites to recreate or create something that's like familiar and makes that more accessible and then creates a space to have those conversations.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, and it didn't cross my mind until now, the times that I would be in the kitchen and I would just be knitting, like maybe I didn't feel like cooking that day or something, and majority of the visitors that would come to Brattonsville, were white. And I noticed that anytime that I wasn't cooking and visitors would walk by, they would see me and they would keep on walking. So I had to cook in order to even bring them, to get them in, to even have the conversation. So you're right, just trying to draw people in a way. Like if you're just, it does make a difference when you're actively interpreting instead of just like sitting in the kitchen and knitting or something like that and having those conversations. Yeah.
So the example of the work is in a little forest town, and it's largely white, like literally half percentage, any POC. And we kind of struggle with the issue that within the last century, we've displaced African American people living in that town. So there is a sense of feeling like we're overstepping because I feel like we struggle to say, okay, we'll get out of our town, but now come back in and talk about your experiences. So I guess what I'm asking is, how do you stay sensitive to the issue without overstepping and turning it into just another white person's platform?
I would suggest if there's any like African American in your area that might want to do like any kind of programming, like open the floor up to them doing the programming, creating some kind of advisory group and hearing what they might want, what type of program they might want to see. Because a lot of times if it's always the white person doing all of it, then you can kind of still kind of make them apprehensive to it. But if you open the floor, create some type of advisory group, bring in, you can actually bring in you can bring me in and do some type of programming, because a lot of times for Black people, for people of color, we have to see ourselves doing the thing, in order for us to come. And that's a message that I try to give out, because you can tell children all day long, oh, you can be a pilot, because I work at Aviation Museum. Oh, you can be a pilot, you can be a flight attendant. But if they never see somebody Black doing it, then they might, but you say I can do it, but I've never seen anyone actually do it. So it might be easier to start off like that. Yes?
We're doing that in our community. It's the same situation. And the Historical Society partnered with what's called the Raymer Archives, that is Black History Archives, and it's run by an elderly gentleman who was actually an activist in the community. So we're working with him, and we're actually bringing in other people, other African Americans to help out and work on this exhibit, and we're hoping to get people excited.
Yeah.
But I have the issue too. It's like I feel I have to tread lightly.
Yeah, you have to you have to get the buy-in.
Yeah.
So you can get the buy-in if you bring in the actual community members themselves. Yeah.
Just some other comments that go along with all of this, and also just acknowledging that the museum field is still mostly white in terms of all of our staff. In this area, which we all come from, we have a lot of colleges and universities. We have a lot of professors of African American history. And there is something that needs to be done to create dialogues with your volunteers and your paid staff before we can get to the point of presenting this to the public, okay? So I feel like it's a really great idea if you've got people that you know who do diversity and inclusion programming, but if you've got professors who teach African American history, especially African American history, if you're looking at this at time before 1872, then reach out to them. Say, listen, we want to put something on with our staff for us to talk about these uncomfortable situations. I don't know how much information they know, your staff knows about specifically about African American history. Would you be willing to come in and do a workshop for us? And then following that, have some conversation within your group that is with someone who is a professional, hopefully someone who is a professional of color, to help facilitate that group. So that can be another place where you can be open and honest, but also allow people to, have conversations that are going to be uncomfortable, because they might say something they've always grown up thinking, and then you're like, actually, that's not right. Or actually, when you say that, how do you think that would make a visitor feel? And so I think that it's really important for us to dive into our scholastic people, because we are very fortunate to have so many colleges and universities around. And you've got to address it with your staff and your volunteers before you're ready to make that step.
Yeah.
Or you're going to have a lot of conflict.
So we do have a few more minutes, but I do agree with that point, because I'm actually going back down to Brattonsville in November, because they are doing exactly that with their volunteers, and they want me to come in and do a workshop pertaining to that on teaching about African American history. Yeah.
I just wanted to go back a little bit to the point of using words
Mm-hmm.
and being inclusive in your word choices. There is a big deal between saying slave and unslaved,
Mm-hmm.
enslaved or enslaved, or slave owner versus slave holder,
Right.
because it's a matter of agency, right? So we as interpreters, we want to make sure that we are interpreting narratives that show people have agency even in the status of bondage. We have to be able to use the proper terminology.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way that we're trying to do some of those things is making sure that we have an interpretive plan that's inclusive, not only in content, but it's using the right words. Instead of saying the African American community, say African American communities, because Black people are not among them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot into words. I mean, sometimes people will get caught up in, well, is it really semantics? No. These are intentional choices that we've been socialized to make these choices.
Yeah.
So we should be very aware of the type of words that we use when we're out there teaching people about these histories.
And if you even notice in my presentation, I was very cognitive of Black Americans versus African Americans, because I choose to use the word Black because even back then, these people were coming from all over the continent of Africa. Most 70% came from West Africa, but when you start getting to one or two generations of these people, they didn't know exactly what country they were from. So it's like we need to include the whole diaspora because the slave trade. You have people come from the Caribbean. You got people from just all sorts of places that are that have dark skin, that are Black skin. So it's about being inclusive of the whole African diaspora. But yeah, is there any other questions? I think we're coming up on time. Yes.
I have another comment on language, similar to what you were saying. It's, when I am speaking about people who were enslaved at Dunstan Hall, over the course of an experience with a visitor, I do not only use people who were enslaved, an enslaved person. It is James, George Mason's enslaved manservant. It is people who were held in bondage at Dunstan Hall. Changing that language over the course of the experience, because eventually our ears were trained to also just stop hearing the difference.
Right.
So change up the vocabulary that you use over the course of the experience with someone to drive home that there is brutality, that there are people who are forced to work in places, and change that up so that people hear it.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you have the documents and the resources to know, because like at Brattonsville, we had the whole probate of all 130. We had all of their names. We would use their names when we did our interpretation, when we did our programming. And a lot of times we had I would write these scenarios, and I would use their actual name because they were people. So I would like to thank you guys for attending my session. And I will say that it made me very happy because today is actually my birthday as well. And I do have information, my card's up here. Please fill out a survey. I would very much appreciate it. So thank you and have a good rest of the conference. Thank you. So I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation on women's suffrage and how museums and different organizations can include the Black narrative into the women's suffrage movement as we're celebrating the 100 years of the 19th Amendment, but remembering that we are still fighting and that we should continue to fight. So with that being said, I wanted to let you guys know that this is the last episode for this season. Hopefully I will be back sometime in April with the second season. And the second season is going to be really great. I'm planning a few new guest speakers to come on to my podcast. So we're going to have some really good topics. I have a great plan of doing a couple of series of topics. I'm not going to tell you what those topics are going to be because I want to kind of surprise you guys. But in the meantime, I will be continuing to write on my blog, so be sure to check that out. Be sure to see what is going on my website, and be sure to follow me on social media. You can find me on Instagram at ByrdOwlconsulting. Facebook, just Bird Owl, and Twitter, you can find me Bird_Owl. So please subscribe, tell your friends about it, leave a 5-star review. You can also leave voice messages. You can always get in touch with me too, as well, by emailing me at ByrdOwlconsulting@gmail.com and put in the byline, the subject line, Bird's Eye View Podcast, so I know what it's referring to. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you come from. And I will see or be back in a couple of months. So bye.